There were 10 minutes left in my shift when the radio crackled to life. Cardiac emergency, Cherry Creek Mansion, patient identified as Billionaire Richard Blackwood. Rain was falling as I drove, steady and heavy, but the situation was under control. When we arrived, the patient asked if he could use the bathroom. I followed the hallway he pointed to, opened the wrong door, stepped inside a sitting room, and stopped cold. Hanging on the wall was a large family portrait, a man in a suit, a woman standing beside him, and a young man. As I looked closer, my legs almost gave out because I recognized two faces in that portrait, two faces I believed I had lost 24 years ago. The call had come in at 11:47 p.m., right near the end of my shift. Chest pain, male in his 60s, address in Cherry Creek, the wealthiest area in Denver. I had worked as a paramedic for 30 years. I had seen everything: heart attacks in trailer parks, overdoses in luxury homes. Death never cared where you lived. Still, when I pulled up to the Blackwood estate, even I hesitated. The house was not just large, it was a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows glowed against the night. A circular driveway curved around a fountain. It looked like the kind of home featured in architectural magazines. Inside, Richard Blackwood sat on a leather sofa, one hand pressed against his chest. He was in his mid-60s, silver hair neatly styled, an expensive watch on his wrist. His pulse was elevated but steady. Mild angina, not a full heart attack. I ran the EKG, started an IV, and gave him nitroglycerin. Everything followed protocol. "You're going to be fine, Mr. Blackwood," I told him, "but you need to see your cardiologist tomorrow." He nodded as color returned to his face. "Thank you. I overreacted. Better to be safe." While my partner packed up the equipment, I asked to use the bathroom. Richard gestured toward the hallway. "Second door on the left." I walked down the corridor, my boots clicking against the marble floor. I opened the second door. It was not a bathroom. It was a sitting room. I was about to leave when something on the wall caught my attention. A massive family portrait, professionally lit. Richard Blackwood in a navy suit, a woman beside him, blonde, elegant, in her mid-50s, and a young man, late 20s, dark hair, confident smile. My breath stopped. I knew the woman's face, the high cheekbones, the shape of her eyes, but what struck me hardest was the scar, a thin white line on her chin. My wife Sarah had that scar. She got it at 12 years old when she fell off her bike in our neighborhood. I had kissed that scar countless times before she disappeared. Then my eyes shifted to the young man. On the right side of his neck, just below the ear, was a small mole. My son Jake had that exact mole. I used to kiss that spot every night before putting him to bed. It couldn't be real. 24 years ago, in the Rocky Mountains, an avalanche buried our hiking trail. I was 30, Sarah was 27, Jake was only 5. I survived, trapped under the snow for hours until rescuers pulled me out. Sarah and Jake were never found. No bodies, no answers, just gone. For 24 years, I lived with that emptiness. I searched, I hoped, I mourned. Eventually, I learned how to carry the weight. But now, that scar, that mole. "Sir, are you okay?" I turned around. My partner stood in the doorway, medical bag in hand. "Yeah," I said, my voice rough. "I'm fine." I left the house in a haze, drove back to the station, changed out of my uniform, got into my 12-year-old Honda, and drove to my one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill. 30 minutes away, a completely different world from Cherry Creek. Inside, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the edge of the couch in the darkness, staring ahead. After a long time, I reached for the shoebox on the shelf. Inside was a single photograph, its edges worn from years of handling. Jake, at 5 years old, smiling while sitting on my shoulders. Sarah beside us, shading her eyes from the sun. A perfect day, taken 2 weeks before the avalanche. I traced my thumb over Jake's face. Could it really be him? I set the photo down and looked out the window at the Denver skyline. Tomorrow, I would find out. Tomorrow, I would learn whether the impossible was real or whether grief had finally broken me. The next morning, I couldn't focus at work. Between calls, I sat in the rig scrolling on my phone. Richard Blackwood, Denver, real estate tycoon, net worth over $200 million. He had built half of Cherry Creek. And there she was, Sarah, blonde, elegant, standing beside him at galas and ribbon-cutting events. One article from 8 years ago mentioned a private wedding. The bride was listed as Sarah Blackwood, no maiden name, no background. Another article from 5 years ago announced that Richard had named his stepson Jake as vice president. The photo showed Jake in a suit beside Richard, mid-20s, confident, successful. My Jake. I called Marcus, my old search and rescue friend from the Avalanche days. He answered on the third ring. "Marcus," I said, 24 years ago, the Avalanche, were there other survivors? Silence filled the line. "Two," he finally said, "a woman and a child, found 3 days later 5 miles from where we pulled you out, hypothermic, barely alive." My chest tightened. What happened to them? Airlifted to Boulder Medical Center, amnesia. They couldn't remember their names. That's all I know. I ended the call. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and called Linda, my partner at the station. I asked her to look up hospital records. It wasn't legal, but I needed answers. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. Boulder Medical Center, March 15, 1999. Patient 1, female, approximately 27, severe head trauma, complete retrograde amnesia. Patient 2, male, approximately 5, hypothermia, traumatic amnesia. 2 weeks of treatment, then discharge. No follow-up, no missing persons reports. They vanished. I cross-checked the dates. Sarah's first public appearance with Richard came 2 years later. Jake appeared in records the same year, listed as Richard's ward. No legal name change, no adoption paperwork, just integration. They lost their memories. They couldn't remember me. And somehow Richard Blackwood had been there. He had taken them in. He had given them new lives. I closed the laptop and stared out the window. Somewhere in Cherry Creek, my wife and son were living a life I no longer belonged to. Tomorrow, I would go back. I would claim it was a follow-up visit, standard protocol. Tomorrow, I would face her and demand the truth. The next morning, I drove back toward Cherry Creek with my hands tight on the steering wheel. I told myself this was about clarity, not confrontation. If I went in angry, I would lose the only advantage I had, truth. I parked a block away from the Blackwood estate and sat there for several minutes, watching the gates open and close for other cars, wondering how many times Sarah had passed through them without any memory of the life we once shared. I didn't wear my uniform. I wore plain clothes, the kind that wouldn't draw attention. I carried a clipboard with a few printed medical notes, enough to make the visit look legitimate if anyone asked. When I rang the gate, a calm voice answered. I explained that I was following up on Mr. Blackwood's emergency call from the night before. The gate opened without hesitation. Inside, everything looked the same as before, but now I noticed details I had missed. Family photos lined the hallway. Vacations, holidays, milestones, years of moments that did not include me. A housekeeper led me to the sitting room. "Mr. Blackwood will be with you shortly," she said. I nodded and waited. My eyes were drawn again to the portrait. Up close, there was no doubt. The scar on Sarah's chin, the mole on Jake's neck, the shape of his hands, the tilt of his smile. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My heart raced, my throat tightened. "Can I help you?" Her voice came from behind me. I turned slowly. Sarah stood there, holding a tablet, her hair tied back casually. She looked older, of course, but it was her. Every instinct in me screamed her name, but I stopped myself. If she truly didn't remember, hearing it from a stranger could do more harm than good. "I'm with the emergency medical team," I said carefully. "I treated Mr. Blackwood last night. I just wanted to check on his recovery." She studied my face, searching for something she didn't understand. "He's resting. His cardiologist adjusted his medication." "That's good. I'm glad he's okay." There was a pause, a long one. "Do I know you?" I replied. "No, I don't think so." Something shifted in her expression, not recognition, curiosity. as if a door in her mind had rattled but not opened. "My name is Sarah Blackwood," she said. "I know," I replied before I could stop myself. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "From the report?" "Yes," I said quickly. "Your name was listed as the primary contact." She nodded, but her eyes stayed on me, unsettled. "Jake should be home later. Richard likes us all here when doctors are involved." Jake. Hearing his name out loud nearly broke me. "I'd like to speak with him too, just briefly." She hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." Richard entered the room a moment later, looking much better than the night before. He thanked me again for my professionalism. We discussed his symptoms, his stress levels, his travel schedule. He was sharp, controlled, used to being in charge. Throughout the conversation, I watched him closely. When Sarah spoke, his eyes followed her. When she paused, he stepped in. When she laughed lightly at something he said, his hand brushed her arm, possessive but subtle. This was not a rescue. This was a replacement. Jake arrived just before noon. The moment he walked in, my chest tightened. He was taller than me now, broad-shouldered, confident. He wore a tailored jacket and carried himself like someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "Dad?" he said, nodding at Richard. Then he turned to me. "You're the paramedic?" "Yes," I said. "I treated your father last night." "Thanks for taking care of him." His voice was deeper, but it was his. I had heard it crack when he was 13. I had heard it whisper when he was afraid of the dark. I wanted to tell him everything. Instead, I said, "There's something I need to ask you, both of you." They exchanged looks. "I believe I knew you before, a long time ago, before you came here." Sarah's face went pale. Jake frowned. "What are you talking about?" 24 years ago, there was an avalanche in the Rockies. A woman and a child survived. They were taken to Boulder Medical Center. Both had amnesia." Richard's posture stiffened. "That's private medical history," he said sharply. "It's also my family." Silence filled the room. Sarah's hand went to her chin, unconsciously brushing the scar. "Avalanche," she repeated softly. Jake touched his neck, right where the mole was. "I don't remember any avalanche." "I know. You wouldn't." Richard stepped forward. "This is inappropriate. You need to leave." "No," I said calmly. "What's inappropriate is hiding the truth for 24 years. Sarah looked between us. "Richard," she said slowly, "what is he talking about?" Richard's jaw tightened. "He's confused. Grief can do strange things." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the photo. I placed it on the table. Jake at 5, Sarah beside me, smiling. Sarah stared at it, her breathing shallow. "That's me," she whispered. Jake leaned closer. "And that's me." I met Richard's eyes. "You didn't save them. You replaced me." Sarah sank into the chair. Her hands trembled. "Richard," he exhaled sharply, as if a decision had been made years ago and could no longer be undone. "You were dying," he said to me. "They had nothing, no memory, no identity. I gave them a life. You gave them your life, not theirs." Jake looked at Richard, confusion turning into something darker. "You said my parents were dead." "I said your past was gone," Richard replied. "There's a difference." Sarah stood abruptly. "I need air." She left the room. Jake followed her, leaving me alone with Richard. "You could have told me, at any point." "And lose them?" he asked. "I loved her. I raised him. I wasn't going to hand them back to a ghost." I stepped closer. "I'm not a ghost." "No," he said quietly. "You're a threat." I left without another word. That night, Sarah called me. "I don't remember you," she said, "but I remember the photo. I remember feeling safe. I remember a man lifting me onto his shoulders. That was me." "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I don't know either, but the truth is out now." The next weeks were chaos. Therapy sessions, medical evaluations, lawyers. Jake oscillated between anger and denial. Sarah struggled with fragmented memories that surfaced without warning. Richard withdrew, his control slipping. One evening, Jake showed up at my apartment. "I don't know who I am," he said, "but I know I was lied to." "You're still you," I replied, "no matter what." He nodded slowly. The family Richard had built began to fracture, not because of hate, but because the foundation was never honest. And the hardest truth of all was this: love built on silence cannot survive the sound of truth. The weeks that followed felt unreal, as if time itself had lost its structure. Days blended together, marked only by phone calls, appointments, and long silences that said more than words ever could. The truth had been revealed, but truth does not instantly repair what has been broken. It only removes the illusion. Sarah began therapy with a neurologist who specialized in trauma-related amnesia. The doctor explained that memory loss caused by extreme shock could remain permanent, or fragments could return slowly, triggered by emotions, smells, or familiar sights. There were no guarantees, only patience. Jake attended sessions too, not because he had lost memories, but because his entire identity had shifted overnight. The man he believed was his father was not. The life he believed was his own had been built on missing pieces. Richard hired lawyers, quiet ones, expensive ones. He never contacted me directly again. Everything went through intermediaries, letters written in careful language, requests framed as cooperation rather than control. But the power dynamic had changed. For the first time, he was reacting instead of directing. One afternoon, Sarah asked to meet me alone. We chose a small cafe downtown, neutral territory. She arrived early and sat near the window, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. When I walked in, she stood instinctively, then hesitated, unsure of herself. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I replied. We sat down. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. "I don't remember our life," she said finally. "Not really. But sometimes I feel like I'm standing in a room I've been in before. I know where the light switch should be, even if I can't see it." I nodded. "That's more than you had before." She looked at me carefully. "Do you hate me?" "No," I said without hesitation. "I never did." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. "Richard told me he saved us, that we had no one." "He saved you from the cold, not from me." She took a shaky breath. "I don't know how to reconcile that." "You don't have to decide anything right now. Just don't ignore what you feel." She nodded slowly. Jake called me a few days later. He wanted to walk, no agenda, just movement. We walked along the river, hands in our pockets, matching pace without realizing it. "He taught me everything," Jake said. "How to negotiate, how to lead, how to win." "And what did he teach you about honesty?" I asked. Jake didn't answer immediately. He finally said, "It's optional." I stopped walking. He stopped too. "You didn't lose your life. You lost context. That can be rebuilt." He looked at me. "Why didn't you come sooner?" "I didn't know where you were, and when I did, I wasn't sure I had the right to disrupt what you believed was real." "You did," he said quietly. "You still do." That night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by the quiet I had grown used to over decades. I thought about the avalanche, the cold, the darkness, how close I had come to dying while believing I had lost everything. I realized something then. I hadn't survived for closure. I had survived for truth. Legal proceedings followed, not criminal, but civil. Questions about guardianship, consent, medical disclosures, ethics. Richard's legal team argued that he acted in good faith, that without him, Sarah and Jake might not have survived. The court acknowledged that. But it also acknowledged that truth had been withheld long after survival was no longer the issue. Settlements were reached, agreements signed, boundaries drawn. Richard kept his wealth, his reputation remained intact in public, But privately, the family he had built no longer functioned the way it once had. Control could not replace trust forever. Sarah moved into a small apartment of her own, not with me, not with Richard. She said she needed space to understand who she was without anyone defining it for her. Jake stepped down from his role at the company. Temporarily, he said. He needed time to decide whether his success belonged to him or to the story he had been given. As for me, I returned to my routine, my job, my small apartment, my quiet life. But it was no longer empty. Sometimes Sarah calls, sometimes Jake does. Sometimes we sit together and look at old photos, letting familiarity grow without forcing memory to catch up. We are not a restored family. We are an honest one, and that matters more. The past cannot be reclaimed. It can only be acknowledged. And for the first time in 24 years, I no longer feel like a ghost walking through someone else's life. I feel present. I feel real. And that is enough. If you want to hear more deep and meaningful life stories like this one, please make sure to subscribe to ZERIX Truth. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible journeys to light.